So now that we've done kind of a deep dive on the OR logical assignment, what about AND? What about a double AND logical assignment? Totally possible. Let's check it out. The AND operator is going to find the rightmost truthy value, or the very first falsy value, sort of the opposite that the OR does. If you look at this AND logical assignment for result 1, you'll see that it takes undefined as an answer because as soon as it has found a falsy value, it short circuits knowing that there is no need to check any further values because it's already found something that's going to cause the whole compound to be false. In other words, 42 is never even examined. In result 2, you can see that the 0 is the first falsy value obtained, and since now we can't make a truth value out of that compound, we're just going to take that 0 and assign it back to result 2. In result 3, we got the empty string first. No matter that there's an object next, we're just going to take that empty string because we obviously can't complete the true value. If we switch it up, we find that we get the same exact results because the compiler is seeking to find only truthy values. And when it finds that something is false at any point, it will assign that false value right back to the variable. When all of the elements are truthy, AND will return the very last truthy value found for assignment, which is what makes it often very useful and very functional in code. So let's take a look at this first one here. On result 1, since King is truthy and Arthur is truthy, what the variable will receive is actually Arthur. We've examined the King, found that it's cool. We move over to Arthur, it's also cool. Let's pass that back to the variable. Notice if I switch them up in result 2 and I've got Arthur first and King second, King gets returned after a full examination. Just to kind of compare that with OR, we had this a little bit earlier. You can see that in the OR situation with King and Arthur, we get King because it is the first truthy value. I didn't need to look at everything, so I just took the first one I could get. In result 2, I take Arthur for the same exact reason. What happens when they're falsy? What happens when both elements of an AND operation are falsy? You can see in result 1 and result 2 that we've short-circuited on undefined and the empty string, respectively, because there's no need to check for any further truth values when we've already found a false. Let's contrast that with the OR situation, which needs to look through all of its entries before finally returning a false value if that's all that was there. So inside result 1 and result 2, we get the empty string for result 1 and undefined for result 2. Now where might you use this AND logical operator? It's very useful in contingent assignments where one thing's got to be true before this next thing can happen. The AND operator is going to let you check as well multiple conditions before we actually allow that assignment. So let's take a look. Here we're going to add some functionality to our armory object. Namely, it's going to be called a retrieve sword property that will hold a function. The parameter for that function will be a request. That means which sword we would like to get or check out of the armory. And we've got an interesting expression here. We're going to return the result of a ternary conditional. Now let's check out how we're generating the condition for this ternary conditional. What we're doing here is actually checking to see first whether the swords array actually holds the sword that we want. So how do we do that? We use the indexOf method, which is a method of the array prototype that will examine an entire array and return the very first found index for any matching value. And if it doesn't find anything throughout the entire array, it will return a -1, which may now be very clear to you why we use a greater than or equal to 0 inside of our check. If the indexOf method returns a value that's positive, that means that our sword that we want is somewhere inside of our big long swords array, right? But if we get a -1, that means that the sword is nowhere to be found, and our ternary conditional should return the false value. So just to illustrate the power of this indexOf method for a moment, let's pass Claymore into the indexOf method on the swords array. What it's going to do is look through that array over there in the armory. You can see that the Claymore exists in index 2. Remember that arrays are 0-based. And it will return that 2, so we know that the Claymore is exactly in index 2. However, if we go hunting in the swords list for a donut, That's going to return -1 because hopefully there is no donut in the swords array. Fight with donuts. Now that you can kind of see how that index of method works, notice that our check in our ternary conditional is looking for a number that is greater or equal to 0. That means we want to verify something actually exists in the swords array, and if it doesn't, it should be a negative number. Now on the left side of our ternary conditional colon, if in fact the sword does exist, we're going to use some index cleverness to remove the sword from the swords array. Let's see how we can do that. We'll use the splice method. Now that's going to remove elements anywhere inside an array by first passing in the index that you want to start at and following that with how many items you want to remove at that index. Let's just take a look for a second. If we create a soldiers array, we got knights, we got pikemen, we got archers, and we splice that array at index 1 for 2 units. Now what does the splice method do here? Well, it's going to go into index 1, which is pikemen. It's going to take out 2 entries, including pikemen and archers. And what does the splice method return? It returns those values that it spliced out inside of their own brand new array. So how can we use this cool splice method to help us remove gently our sword from the swords array? Well, you can see inside the splice method that we pass in the index of our requested sword using the index of method. Following that, you see that 1 right there? That's saying go to the index where the sword is and just take out 1 sword. That's all we want is 1 sword. Now since the splice method returns an array, but we only want the string of the sword, we will need to access the 0th index of the array that gets returned. That's what that little bracketed 0 is doing there. It's going to return us the single string from inside the returned array of the splice method. Yay for code. And then after the colon, if we never found that sword originally when we went to check for it, we need to go ahead and say, yo man, that sword ain't here. And that's going to be useful when we actually employ our double and assignment. So now let's go ahead and try to use our retrieve sword method that we've added to the armory. We're going to set up a variable called isKnight here, and we're going to set it equal to true. We only want knights, to be able to get swords out of the armory. We don't want serial killers running around with weapons from the armory. That could reflect poorly and suck moderately, so let's not do that. The next thing we'll do is have a variable called weapon, and we're going to set up our very cool and logical assignment. The very first thing that and will check is whether the person that's asking for a sword is a knight. Well, isKnight is currently true, so and here is going to keep checking. And what is it checking on the other side of the and? It's a call to a function. Okay, so let's see what happens here. If the result of our retrieve sword function happens to be a string, well, a string is truthy, right? So we'll get precisely the sword we're looking for, because remember that and returns the final truthy value that it encounters. Cool, so let's see what happens when we try to get this katana assigned to the weapon variable. First, is there even a katana in the swords array? Our index of method goes over to the swords property, checks the array, finds a katana, ding, returns index 1. And since that is greater than 0, we get a truth value in our condition, and the ternary will execute the splice method on the left-hand side of our colon. So now let's see what happens when we try to get the katana out of the swords array and pass it into the weapon variable. So we're going to splice that swords array exactly at katana, and that's going to hand us back another array, and from that array we're going to take the string at the 0th index. This will also remove the katana from swords. So now the retrieve sword has passed back a string katana, which is truthy, and also isKnight has a truthy value. Both of those things are truthy, so we will take the right-hand side of the and logical statement and put that inside the weapon variable. Check it out, when we log out that weapon, we see katana. Woohoo! Cool, so we got the katana out. What happens if we try to get a rapier out of the swords array? Well, we pass in rapier into the function, and the index of goes over to the array and checks and sees Whap, whap. There is no rapier in the array. We need to make a purchase order, I guess, or something. But it's not there now. So what's going to happen is that condition will be false. And on the right-hand side of the colon, we will choose the alert method. And once that alert message is called, you can see we get our pop-up box. But what happens to retrieve sword? What happens when the very last thing it has done is call an alert method? Well, it happens to be that it returns an undefined value. So since that undefined value is the very last thing our AND value finds and it's falsy, it's going to toss that undefined value over into weapon, and weapon will be undefined. There will be no weapon inside it. Now you might ask, what happens when is_knight is false? I mean, we don't want some random dude coming up to the armory and requesting a weapon, right? So if it's false, turns out retrieve sword will never even get called. Remember, because AND logical assignment will take the very first falsy value it ever finds. So since is_knight is false, that false is going to get tossed over into the weapon variable. If we log out the weapon variable, we can see that this becomes false. An extra bit here, logical assignments are actually extendable. You can string together as many operators as is necessary to choose whatever right assignment you would like to. So let's scoot our stuff down here, and you can see that we've got a new variable called armory is open, and we're going to set that equal to true. Inside of our AND logical assignment, we're going to add that armory is open variable as a new condition. This is an extended logical assignment. So now, if the armory is open, which it is, and the person is a knight, which they currently are, and if there's a claymore in the array for the swords and that gets returned, then we'll take that sword and assign it to the weapon variable. That happens here, so you can see when we log out the weapon, we get the claymore. So what happens when the armory is closed? It's not open. Well, we don't want to be passing swords out after hours, right? So the double AND, that first double AND, will see that armory is open is false, and that will instantly get assigned to the variable weapon with a short circuit, not looking at any of the other stuff that's present in our extended assignment. You can see that when we log out the weapon this time, we get false because the armory was not open. Come back when the shop's open, man. And you come back after these challenges. See you in the next section.